Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Schultz. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the School of Public Health. And I am delighted to welcome you all to our next presentation in the series on confronting environmental racism and promoting environmental justice, organized by the M-LEEaD Course Center. We can go to the next slide. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement and to recognize that the University of Michigan originated from the sale of lands that were ceded by the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, in conjunction with their neighbors, the Fox, the Peoria, and the Wyandot nations. Almost all property in the United States was obtained through unconscionable means, and understanding the history of genocide and settler colonialism that underlies contemporary health inequities can help us create a foundation for applying our research, teaching, and practice to create a more just and equitable future. We can go to the next slide. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, a lifelong learner and advocate, Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, recently founded Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, LLC, a strategic consulting firm with the mission of transforming communities through the development of people-centered solutions. She serves a diverse set of clients with forward-thinking and intersectional approaches to tackle issues such as climate change, public health, environmental injustice, and advancing racial equity. Dr. White-Newsome has multi-sector experience, having worked in environmental philanthropy, state government, nonprofit, grassroots, academia, and private industry. Most notably, she created and implemented the Transformational Climate Resilient and Equitable Water Systems, or CREWS, initiative at the Kresge Foundation as a senior program officer. She was also the first director of We Act for Environmental Justice's Federal Policy Office in Washington, D.C., and her doctoral research illuminated the impact of climate change and extreme heat on the low-income elderly and in Detroit, and is still referenced to drive public health interventions. A native of Detroit, Dr. White-Newsome earned a PhD in environmental health sciences from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, a master's degree in environmental engineering from Southern Methodist University, a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern University, and her certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University. Dr. White-Newsome serves on multiple national and local academic, nonprofit, and for-profit boards. She is a lecturer at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health, a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and the proud mom of Ariel and J. Anna Lynn, or JJ, whose 13th birthday is tomorrow. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. White-Newsome as our speaker today, and I'm going to turn it over to her at this point.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Amy, so much for the kind introduction. And it is wonderful to be here, albeit virtual. I want to first thank, again, Meredith and Robin, and Amy and Dr. Marie O'Neill for the opportunity, and Michigan LEED for the invitation. It's even more special to be a part of all of the activities and presentations and acts of service to acknowledge the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So before we dig in today, I want to thank you, Amy, for that recognition, and also acknowledge that I'm calling from the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi peoples here in southeastern Michigan. And I want to honor both my ancestors that are living and deceased, because I wouldn't be here today if it were not for them. So as I was reflecting a couple years ago in 2020, at the same time, I was sharing with the public health community on the campus of University of Michigan on the topic of miseducation of us on climate and health. And it was a pretty decent sized crowd. We were in a room together. We were sitting next to each other. We didn't have masks on. We were sometimes holding hands and singing songs. And boy, how much the world has changed. And unfortunately, how much the world has stayed the same. In one of Dr. Martin Luther King's probably lesser known by some speeches, The Other America, which he delivered at Stanford in the late 60s and many other places, the sentiments, the stories, the context, and the data lead me to believe that there is, in fact, 62 years later, in 2022, another America. Dr. King in his talk so eloquently shows us exactly what that other America is and what it looks like in 1967 America, particularly for Black Americans where there was high unemployment, many folks living in slums and unhealthy environments. But let's take a step back and let's think about the definition of other or othering. I love the activist Dr. John Paul, the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and he defines othering as a set of dynamics and processes and structures that engender marginality and persistent inequality across a range of human identities. These identities, of course, can include what's on the list. And I would imagine, again, that as we think about Dr. King's other America, which he described, and Dr. Powell's definition of othering, that it is very similar to what we see playing out, unfortunately, in 2022. And so recent studies again show that from a housing and an unemployment and a COVID impact, that this other America still exists in 2022. In fact, redlining, again, the historical practice of limiting access to housing for Blacks and immigrants and others still has its impacts, again, because folks were forced to live in places and buy homes with dilapidated infrastructure. And today, according to a recent brokerage survey by Redfin, there's over 100 billion worth of homes in redline areas that are experiencing high flood risk. Also, Blacks continue to have the highest unemployment rates compared to other groups. And we all should be familiar with by now the unfortunate fact that COVID tends to impact Black folks the most. But as it relates to environmental justice and climate justice, there is still another America. In fact, Black folks are exposed to higher concentrations of pollutants than others. Unfortunately, our children have higher rates of asthma in our communities. Again, most African Americans are going to be living in places that will be experiencing the impact of extreme heat, resulting in higher mortality rates. And our Native American brothers and sisters and Latino brothers and sisters are more likely to be impacted by extreme heat where they work. So again, I think it's really interesting that this other America that Dr. King talked about included the traditional threats that we think about to our environment, our dirty air, hazardous waste, contaminated groundwater supplies, unhealthy housing, the list can go on and on. But all these things, all these original traditional environmental conditions are unfortunately exacerbated by climate change. And I posit that this other America that Dr. King talked about in the 60s is in many ways, again, not only alive right now, but made worse by climate change. And so as I look at his speech, the words climate change weren't mentioned, but little did he know that his support of the Memphis sanitation workers strike, again, back in the 60s, fighting for better wages and working conditions would be one of the fires that sparked the environmental justice movement and ultimately the climate justice movement, which again is focused on making sure that everyone has access to a clean and healthy environment, regardless of what you look like and where you come from. Again, that goal or that aspiration of environmental justice is making sure that everyone enjoys the same degree of protection. And we see that not only in that definition, but in some of the principles and the policies and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that has that same sentiment. So, the environmental and climate justices, again, that define this other America is the result of industrialization, of capitalism. And again, this overarching statement that it's okay for certain people to live in a other unfortunate America where health, wealth, and power are not only afforded to some, but not to many at all. And so recognizing as a country that we still have a lot to do, my question to you in this virtual space is whether you're a student, a researcher, an advocate, or just a human being interested in this topic, if Dr. King were alive today, what advice would he give us as we create our research agendas to fulfill his vision of eliminating that other America or the othering of America? So what would be his advice? Well, unfortunately, I did not have the honor to know Dr. King personally, but I would imagine that he would want us to consider three foundational elements as we play all our unique roles in research, advocacy, and other intersecting spaces to eliminate that othering of America. And so the three pieces are the three foundational elements that I think Dr. King would want as a part of any agenda, include it being educational, it being transformational, and it being beneficial. So let's start with educational. So my first significant research, unless you count my science fair projects in middle school, which my parents were super proud of, was my doctoral research that involved characterizing the risk of extreme heat on senior citizens living in homes and high rises in the city of Detroit. Back in 2007, when I started this work under the guidance of Dr. Marie O'Neill at the School of Public Health, extreme heat was not that sexy. I mean, heat was not seen as the threat to health that we all realize it is today. And so the one reason I knew heat was a threat was because I was in Chicago during the heat wave in 1995 that unfortunately killed hundreds of folks. And I was in Paris during the heat wave of 2003. But it didn't hit home for me until it started impacting the people that I knew and loved, my grandparents. And so a big part of my dissertation work was to try and not only educate my grandparents, but their neighbors, their doctors, the city of Detroit, the Detroit Area Agency on Aging, and other organizations that, again, on the threat of heat, could protect low-income Americans, our elder Americans, and houseless persons that are typically at a higher risk of heat stress and heat stroke. So my research was this combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. We actually set up temperature measuring devices inside the homes of folks and outside the homes to capture temperatures, as well as outside meteorological conditions and variables. And I remember sharing and explaining some of those graphs and temperature charts with my seniors as I would go check on in on every week, and really made sure that they needed to adjust their behaviors when they decided to clean, when they decided to cook, and just make sure that they knew when their home was unsafe and when they needed to leave their home because the heat was a threat to their health. As I often say, while heat doesn't discriminate, the impacts of heat and other climate extremes hit certain communities harder. And we continue to see that for many reasons. You know, communities are not prepared for climate extremes. The physical infrastructure, whether it's the fact that our homes aren't weatherized or we have inadequate, inaccessible cooling shelters, the fact that it's just not resilient and ready for what we're experiencing. And of course, the underlying racism that has contributed to unhealthy housing, dirty air, and other negative cumulative impacts experienced by communities of color across the US and across many different countries. And so, as Dr. King puts it, what the research substantiates is a tragedy of racism and indifference, and that its ultimate logic is genocide. It's not just that we have horrible environmental conditions in some places and climate change might hit a couple of communities harder than others. It's for me the fact that some people seem inferior and not worthy of protection when everyone, all Americans, deserve it. So again, as I mentioned, Dr. King gave this same speech in multiple places to various audiences. And I believe it was not in an effort just to hear his own voice, but to educate and make these connections explicit. So in order to advance environmental justice and climate justice and health, our research has to have an educational component. So people and communities realize that there can be a different America, even when your everyday reality looks a little bit different. So I implore you, as you go about your research or your advocacy or your work, that you always ask yourself two questions. The first being, what is the learning that I am leaving on the table or in this community or with my partners? And the second, what have I learned that is going to change me for the better? So building on the words of Dr. King, I believe that the educational aspect of research will help us move away from that genocide that he talks about. Secondly, I propose that research agendas need to be transformational. Now, at the top of the year, which we're still at, we might be looking to transform ourselves, whether it is losing weight or in other ways. And so we might also be involved in transformational movements that are looking at transforming institutions and big structures. But we also have to realize that transformations can be uncomfortable and painful, like that of the butterfly, but they might take a little bit more time, but lead to something beautiful. And so in Dr. King's talk at Stanford, he articulates the need for required transformation at the institutional, structural, and individual level. In fact, transformation that might start with a change in legislation can lead to a change in behavior that eventually leads to a shift in attitude and ultimately a change of heart that can work to eliminate that other America. But when I think about transformational research and particularly how it can drive justice and environmental health, I think about the fact that it's not just research that lands in a journal with the highest impact factor or lands me a spot on a national news outlet. In fact, transformational research can facilitate a dramatic change in the form and the appearance of cultural, physical, and social dynamics of any situation. And in this case, help us achieve environmental and climate justice. So what it looks like is that it doesn't resemble what research might have looked like before. Transformational research should be shaped by the environment. It should be impactful, promote change. It importantly exposes the invisible threats and unseen barriers, and it provides an opportunity to address racism. But of course, transformation, again, can be a little bit uncomfortable because sometimes it changes the nature of relationships for the better. So building on that last bullet of changing and transforming relationships, last year, my practice was asked by a local foundation to really look at how philanthropic practice, so funding practices, could be transformed in order to better support the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations. And so particularly those organizations working on environment and environmental justice in the Great Lakes region. And so I wanted to be more intentional about what this transformational research could be or what the process could be, and not just take on the regular foundation research process where the foundation gives you questions, you answer them, and then bam, you're done. So what we decided to do was pull together a dynamic group of community-based leaders of color and have them shape our research, have them help us co-create some questions and tell us who we needed to talk to. And it was just not the opportunity to get the research done, but it was also an opportunity to build relationship with each other. And what I will tell you is that one of the members underscored for me that time that it took to build relationship just among us as women and women of color was all, again, it was super valuable. And that getting to know people on a personal and professional level reminded me that the time for trust is invaluable. So our team pushed us to generate a set of qualitative research questions that forced us to not shy away from the heavy hitters and topics that could make folks in philanthropy feel uncomfortable. So we asked why certain groups were funded or not, why folks felt that sometimes on the community side that their knowledge was extracted and then they would take that information and go fund a white-led organization. We asked why certain groups only were funded for a year and why systems change is not funded and is expected to happen in the life cycle of a grant funding cycle. So those are just a couple of questions. But last year when we released the report, we received feedback from funders that it was, quote, real. It was hard to read, but it was true. But it also gave them a pathway to transform the way they do things. And from the 30 or so community-based organizations that we shared this with and that we had interviewed, it is also giving them the data to advocate, the data to disrupt systems that are sometimes more committed to pretty outcomes and less focused on building the infrastructure for prosperity in communities. And so what I want to share with you is that this opportunity presented by this research to transform how we value relationships, even when we are searching for answers within our research, allows us an opportunity to transform sectors and ultimately transform communities. So as Dr. King shared, again, I truly believe research can be a critical element of transformation of our minds, habits, and our hearts. So last and importantly, the research needs to be beneficial. And I'll talk a little bit about another research project called the Roosevelt Project. And this was shepherded by a center at MIT that's focused on environmental, energy, and policy research. And my team was asked to look at and explore the environmental justice implications in communities across Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio of manufacturing operations, auto manufacturing operations that were shifting from making combustion engines to electric vehicles. And so our report pictured here discussed the environmental justice, climate, and health implications of this transition. And as a part of this analysis, we not only looked at the legacy and the impact of brownfields and other pollution sources, but also looked at what equitable practices and policies existed that were used by the other cities and counties to make sure that as these communities and this industry goes through this transition, that no one is left behind. We also had the opportunity to talk to, again, about 30 community leaders across these different states, ranging from public health folks to community advocates and energy experts and researchers, to really try and shape a set of recommendations for policy, for practice, and for how resources should be deployed. And coincidentally, right before we were about to finalize and release this paper, I learned that a group of Detroiters, the Just Benetoo residents on the east side, had been suffering from odors and sickness due to the emissions from a Chrysler or Stellantis facility that had just been expanded to produce electric vehicles. And unfortunately, this situation brought this research to life. That production of electric vehicles, which is theoretically supposed to make the air cleaner, communities healthier, and to help reduce emissions that are driving climate change, was actually making folks sick. And while I don't have time for the whole story, what I will say is the injustices that have been perpetuated by this situation on the east side are a combination of a lack of environmental control, so it's an engineering question, a lack of enforcement from our government, a failed community benefits agreement that is again undergirded by environmental racism. And those were just some of the factors that continue to put this community at risk. But despite this harsh reality and a little bit of serendipity, we were able to incorporate the story of these residents in our final report. And one of the residents, Mr. Shobe, a strong community activist and resident of Benetoo Street, living at the fence line of this plant, and now a wonderful partner and friend, has used our little report to support their awesome advocacy in this fight for justice against Stellantis and the need for air monitoring and other protections. So this is a real example that exemplifies why research must be beneficial and useful to the communities and decision makers that are pushing advocacy platforms, policies, and resources, because again, those are the pieces that will ultimately help us get rid of that other America that Dr. King talked about. And so, I realize that if we are going to be advancing, and there's a word missing on this slide, I'm sorry, environmental and climate justice, I am excited about the signs that I'm seeing in 2022. In fact, that we're seeing an increase in the research funding for work at this intersection of climate change, environmental justice, and cumulative impacts, that we're seeing more funds going to community-based organizations. We have an administration in DC that is climate and EJ friendly, as I call it. We see institutions of all levels and sectors beginning to address racism. And the fact, unfortunately, that climate change cannot be ignored anymore, because we are seeing the extreme weather that continues to impact communities across this country. And my hope is that, again, even though COVID has been awful, that we use the lessons learned from this pandemic in, again, our public health practice. So I am convinced, again, that we have signs of hope. and that this hope will be contagious. But I want to go back to that question before I close that I posed at the start of our conversation. If Dr. King were alive today, what advice would he give us to create research agendas that fulfill his vision and eliminate the othering of America? And so I challenge you on today, January 18th, to reflect on your own research agenda and your own roles, and particularly the what, the how, and the why. So what drives the research, or what should drive your research? It should be community initiated, community beneficial, practical, time sensitive, and timeless. And it should address multiple challenges because none of us live in a bubble. How should the research be done? We have to embrace humility. We have to activate those principles of justice and democratic organizing that I shared earlier. We have to learn to share and give up some power. We have to value voices and honor flexibility. And why is research needed? Transformational research needed? Well, it's needed to expose hidden threats, to make those connections, to promote change, to achieve justice, and ultimately to eliminate that other America. And so, again, I encourage you to think about those basic questions, those three foundational elements that I believe will help us get rid of that other America and make this, in fact, our America. So commit to using your research, your voice, your power in whatever roles you play. And again, we can create that one America where we can all breathe clean air, drink clean water, be prepared for climate change, repel fear, and share love in working to manifest the vision that Dr. King had for us as a country. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to whatever time we have for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. White-Newsome. I want to invite people who have questions or comments, things that you'd like to discuss further with our speaker for today. Please feel free to pop your questions into the chat. Or you can also use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I'm going to start us off. Thank you so much for that really wonderful presentation. And I love your focus on thinking about ways that we can use our research to amplify or to contribute information to struggles for justice that are unfolding every day. I want to invite you I would love to hear your thoughts. You commented about a failed community benefits process around the Beneteau area with the new plant that's going in there. And I want to invite you to reflect a little bit about what are the challenges with community benefits processes, and where are there opportunities to strengthen those processes? I know in particular in Detroit, there were a couple of different community benefits options that were put forward. One was accepted, one was not accepted. And I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about that process.
Sure. And I will give you the disclaimer. I am not the community benefits process expert. But what I will say is that you are right. There were a couple of different options that Detroiters could have chosen. And from colleagues and folks that I've talked to, it comes down again to that educational piece. If folks don't understand the different elements of the agreement and the powers that be, or the powers that have more leverage or more resources are, in the position to push their own agenda, then unfortunately the gaps and the missing pieces that will, again, contribute to something like what we're seeing on the East Side will persist. So what I think is so important is that everybody understands that these community benefit agreements should benefit the community. So what the community puts forward, should be a priority. But it has to have, again, the data and the understanding as to, what will happen if, and I like to say in many cases, did we take this process through an equity analysis? So did we ask those questions of who would benefit, or if we decide to go down this path, what could be some of those unintentional consequences? And I think in many ways, unfortunately, we're remiss in doing that, particularly in the government sector. And so while the community had a plan, they had a vision, they have a vision for the East Side, and particularly this community, it was kind of pushed to the side. And so how do we begin to, one, make sure that we have some accountability and that equity analysis in our different processes, but also how do we make sure that we position community leaders in these spaces in influential positions of power so they are the ones that can begin making these critical decisions? So it's a combination, again, of education, it's a combination of understanding who holds the power, but also figuring out ways to make sure that the power gets into the hands of communities, whether it be through elections or positions or, councils or accountability. There was one example of putting together an accountability council. So again, when these things happen, someone has to, front up for it.
Thank you very much. We've got some wonderful questions that are starting to pop in here. I'll start with the first one, and I'm going to broaden it a little bit. The question is, how might all specializations within Cs, and I'm going to say, how might all specializations within the School of Public Health also include environmental justice in their work?
Definitely. I think I'm a big, I guess, I push education a lot. And the first thing, and what the work that I do with a lot of my clients that now are like, okay, I need to pull equity in, or I need to pull environmental justice into my work. How do I do that? Well, the first thing is you have to understand what it is and what it means to whatever you're doing. So whether you're a person in public health, whether you're a researcher, whether you're working at a large environmental nonprofit, what are the inequities that can happen as a result of how you do your work, or who you do your work, or who you don't do your work with? And so just taking time to reflect on what equity and justice means to you and your role is the first point. And then really taking a look to see, okay, are there places or people or things that are not informing or shaping how I do my work? And again, so I think, again, that self-reflection is important. Understanding, what is in your container and what can you influence and change. And then, putting in the steps and the practices and the processes to do that is usually the first step that I would say any entity should do if they're trying to bring equity, environmental justice a little bit deeper into their work.
Thank you. Second question that we have is, what are some organizations that we can join to help contribute to this research?
What specific research? I want to make sure that I answer the question. Let me see here. Answer the question.
Yeah. Does the person who submitted that question, could you add a little bit there so that Dr. White-Newsome can respond maybe appropriately? And while we wait for you to do that, we'll go to the next question. And so the next question is, what are some of the priorities for research that could help support the achievement of Justice 40 in your mind?
Yeah, I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is really the opportunity for all this funding that's coming down to actually get to communities that need it the most. Because oftentimes that's the exact opposite of what happens. You have large funding streams from the federal government that then go to the states, and the mechanisms and the infrastructure to move those resources to the communities that need it the most is not there. Oftentimes it could be, the result of very, extensive and convoluted processes that a local, whether it be a public health department or another local agency, is understaffed and again, doesn't have the capacity to access those funds. So, what I think is going to be really important as we see these a gazillion dollars coming down is that there is some accountability in place. And, because the focus of this administration is on environmental justice and racial equity, how are we going to make sure, and potentially as a part of a research agenda, which is something I'm interested in, that these dollars get to the right places, but then what are the dollars then used for? What I've seen, in many instances is that, again, these pots of money either sit in a state or locality and they're not used, or they're actually used by the same communities that often get the funds over and over again. And so what are the ways that we need to think about removing those barriers to make sure that communities have access to these funds? And then once those funds are accessed, are they actually making a difference, whether it's around climate change or health, whatever? So I think those are some of the, at least for me, some of the more interesting pieces, in addition to some of the basic things like, okay, as we, for example, deploy this, large electric vehicle infrastructure, who's going to benefit from that? Who is benefiting from that? So all these different changes that are happening, just making sure that they're actually benefiting the right people and the folks that have been left out for so long.
And I think really going back to your earlier comments about the importance of doing an equity analysis, right, all the way through the process. There's a question in the chat that's asking you whether you see the recent snowfall in Atlanta as an extreme climate pattern. And while you collect your thoughts, I also want to thank Sandra Turner Handy for chiming in on the community benefits agreement question through the chat. So for those who would like to see that response also.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing weather in places that we haven't seen in most places. And, I think we have extremes, but, we also, I would say, how to say, extreme weather climate pattern. I guess I'll go back to when I think about living in Texas many, many years ago. And, I wouldn't have ever thought in that it would be snow or ice or anything below 60 or 70 degrees. And so when I was living in Texas, that seemed extreme to me. And so I think as we see all of these different places experiencing these different weather patterns, whether you denote it as extreme or not, it is something that we have to acknowledge and begin to prepare for. And so, again, it is a climate pattern. We are going to see these different changes in our climates in places that we've never seen it before, and how we adjust and prepare and make sure that, again, the infrastructure that's supposed to be in place is there, and we're keeping our community safe and health is super important. So that's how I would, I guess, respond to that. But yeah, we're going to keep on seeing these things, unfortunately, in different places that we haven't seen before.
And they pop up in different kinds of ways also. It's not always snow, it's floods and fire and different kinds of things. So thank you. We've got a clarification on the first question that was asked about organizations that one might join to help guide research. And you asked what specifically for more information about research. Clarification is research that identifies and assists the communities at most risk for environmental maladies.
Sure. So I thank you for that clarification. And I would just suggest, what I suggest to even my students is really, again, looking around your community, your neighborhood, where you are, finding something that you're passionate about, and then finding the organizations that are working on that. And oftentimes, again, I think about, my experience at We Act for Environmental Justice, and we were always in need of support, research assistance help, advocacy help, campaign help on all the different issues that we were working on. And so, again, I would suggest looking at those organizations in your community that are working on something that you're interested in or think you're passionate about, and asking how you might be of service and step in and use your skills as a researcher or a student to assist them in their work.
Thank you. So we have the next question, I think, is one that you're uniquely positioned to address. It's asking about philanthropy and asking specifically how to incorporate social justice when seeking funds for community-based research.
Mhm. So thinking about the transformation that philanthropy is experiencing, this is a good time because in many ways, now most foundations, a lot of foundations have been around for hundreds of years, and it is hard breaking those institutional practices. But I believe that this is the time where foundations are taking that hard look at themselves and doing some self-reflection about what they've been funding, who they've been funding, who they haven't been funding, and then what about their process is making it hard for certain organizations and people to get funded. So what I would say is this is a good time because in many ways, particularly funding in the areas from my experience and at climate change, environmental justice, that a lot of that support is going to continue to really be focused on building the capacity of Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations. And so I would say, if anything, and I don't want to assume, Ashley, if you're coming from representing a community-based organization and you're looking for community-based research funds that, continue to, again, reach out to those foundations that are interested in funding in the areas that you're working in, and how to incorporate social justice when you're seeking those funds. Again, think about the people and the process and the practices that can be changed and shifted to address the impacts and needs of those populations that are made more vulnerable because of situations. So if you're a community-based organization seeking funds, I would say, again, that is on the radar of a lot of philanthropy. But as a researcher, again, I'm not sure if you're a researcher, Ashley, or not, but if you are, I would again suggest, thinking about, again, how do you begin? And there's, again, multiple resources at University of Michigan and other folks like Amy that have done this for many years. How do you begin to build authentic partnerships with community-based organizations or those leaders working in communities where you can, again, add your value and expertise to, maybe a project, a situation that community is already working on. And so even, as I'm actively, for example, reviewing some things for an agency right now related to grant funding, you're seeing some of the requirements and the specificity around asking, okay, so what is your community engagement plan? How does this relate to environmental justice? Is it innovative? All these different questions. So what I would say is that just make sure that your approach as a researcher, again, going back to some of the things that I mentioned, is one of humility, but also that it's serving multiple purposes. So while you might have an objective or something in mind for your research, oftentimes, not saying you leave that at the door, but you need to be open and flexible to what the needs are in that community if community-based research is really what you want to do. So what is going to be that driver? How do you amplify or elevate an issue or a concern that's already happening, and also complement it with your research questions? So Ashley, I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure if, again, where you're coming from, but.
Thank you. The next question is submitted both in the Q&A column and in the chat. So it's a question that someone really wants you to answer. And the question is, a challenge seems to be how to craft and pass transformative and universalistic policy that tackles inequalities that disproportionately affect the poor and people of color. Do you think there are particularly helpful strategies on this, including how to frame and couch things?
Okay, so how to pass impactful policy, because I'm not seeing the question, and how to frame and couch that. So I will go back to, again, my experience as the director of federal policy. And a lot of what we were doing during the Obama administration was trying to push and support and advocate for strong environmental and climate policies. And so one of the ways that, again, we tried to do that was, one, really force the agency, and I would say particularly for the Clean Power Plan, which was the proposed plan to reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants across the country, and required states to reduce their emissions in many different ways. One of the things that we were able to get into that plan was to require states to do an equity analysis. And part of that analysis was actually looking at, okay, if this state needs to reduce this much CO2, then what are the ways that they are going to do it? And how are those ways actually going to be more harmful or beneficial? Because as you probably know, there are many ways that we can think about reducing carbon, whether it be a carbon tax, or cap and trade, or renewable energy. And so really making sure that whatever policies that we put forward as a larger community, that it wasn't going to bite us in the butt at the end. So many folks from the environmental justice movement at that time, and some still now, we never really supported cap and trade because it was what we considered a false solution. You were actually shifting the position. You weren't actually getting rid of the pollution, particularly in the communities that needed the reductions. So as you talk about making these transformational shifts with big policy, and you have to make sure that these entities and agencies that are putting forth these policies are asking the right questions to make sure that the new solution or the cool solution of the day isn't going to make things work. So I think that is the most important thing. And the second piece is that you're not writing policies in an ivory tower or in a building by yourself. Making sure that those policies or whatever you're putting forward is informed and shaped by the communities that are going to either hopefully reap the benefits of that policy or might be impacted detrimentally. And so we worked again hand in hand for the Clean Power example with the EPA, with other, I would say, supporters of, policies and actions that we thought would actually make our air situation worse, because we wanted these folks to understand where we were coming from and why this was tension, a source of tension. So then we could maybe come to a consensus that, would, again, not make everybody happy. But if the ultimate goal of, again, I'm focusing on climate policies, is to reduce the impacts and improve air quality, then, there's a way that we can get there that is going to hopefully be beneficial to everyone. So that would be my first approach.
Thank you. I'm going to pull the next question out of the chat because I think it follows on the response that you just gave. And this question is, can you talk about how you think the massive changes that seem to be required to reduce our carbon emissions and reduce our impact on the earth, examples including carbon taxes, renewable energy, local sourcing, reduced materialism, will impact Black communities? Do you see this as an opportunity to level the playing field, or are you worried that will only exacerbate the inequalities? Clearly, you're worried about the latter because you've spoken to that in the example you just gave. But I wonder if you want to expand on that in response to this question.
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it really depends how we move forward and what the process is that we use. I feel like I'm hopeful that, again, there's opportunities to, as you say, level the playing field. But the way things are going now, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. I think that there needs to be a large shift in the solutions that we're looking at, who's driving the solutions, and who's going to have access to those solutions. Because, right now, and I'll just use the example in terms of electric vehicles, there are so many questions that have been unanswered. And so as we think about reducing carbon emissions, as you speak to, a big part of that is transportation. And when you think about transportation, you think about cars and buses and other forms. And so, if we are only, for example, thinking about electric vehicles, electric passenger vehicles, and the questions of who can afford those EVs, where the charging stations are located, will they be in low-income communities and communities of color? What's going to happen to the batteries used in these EVs when their life is over? So we haven't begun to dig into the question around waste and managing that waste, because it will probably end up in places that it shouldn't be, in communities that it shouldn't be. So, one of the things that worry me is that there's a lot of questions that we haven't answered around the deployment of, again, electric vehicles and other forms of, renewable energy. But, again, I think there's an opportunity, but we need to catch up with the technology and catch up with the field to make sure that the right people and the right groups are in these conversations. Because if not, like you say, it is going to continue to exacerbate those inequalities. Because if we, again, for example, with the EVs are still plugging in, to charge our EVs, but the energy source is a dirty coal-fired power plant that's situated in a low-income community and community of color, that community is not going to benefit. So we have to really, again, and I sound like a broken record, but ask the right questions and look at the entire holistic picture of these cool new solutions that we're thinking about. So I do believe that we can get there, but we have to be super intentional and ask the right questions and involve the right people, or it will unfortunately make it worse.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for all the wonderful, thoughtful questions you've been raising as part of this dialogue, and apologies to those of you who raised questions that we weren't able to get to within our time frame. And thank you, Meredith, for posting the next webinar in the chat for those who are interested, coming up February 8th. And I will close by asking everyone to join me in a heartfelt thanks to Dr. White-Newsome for taking this time to talk with us and share her expertise with us. And Jalonne, you might want to check the chat. There's lots of accolades coming in there for you. Thank you so much.